To save his company from ruin, he made a deal with the devil. He annulled his marriage and handed his wife over to a ruthless old mob boss like a piece of property, a sacrificial lamb on the altar of his ambition. He sold her. Years later, a meeting was called to decide the fate of his struggling company. The woman who walked into the boardroom, flanked by guards and radiating an aura of absolute power, was not a ghost from his past. She was the new head of the criminal empire he had sold her to. And she had returned not for reconciliation, but for revenge. His obsession was about to begin. If you believe that the deepest scars forge the strongest souls, and that every debt, especially those of the heart, must be paid, then like this video and subscribe to the channel. Serafina's rise from the ashes will be a spectacle to behold. The charity gala was a symphony of polite lies and calculated smiles. Julian, the young, brilliant president of Ethelred Incorporated, moved through the glittering crowd with the practiced ease of a man born to the role. His company, a rising star in the competitive world of high-end electronics, was his creation, his obsession, his entire world. By his side, his wife, Serafina, was a vision of ethereal beauty. Dressed in a flowing gown the color of a twilight sky, she was quiet, gentle, an artist whose soul resonated more with the melancholic notes of a cello than with the sharp, discordant symphony of the stock market. Their marriage, now in its second year, was an arrangement of mutual benefit. He gave her family's old respected name the modern power and financial security it lacked. She gave his sharp, ambitious image a touch of class, a soft edge that made him seem less like a predator and more like a prince. But Julian did not feel like a prince. He felt like a fraud. Beneath the perfectly tailored tuxedo, his heart hammered with a cold, terrifying dread. Ethelred Inc. was dying. A disastrous venture into a new market, coupled with a series of aggressive, targeted attacks by larger rivals, had bled the company dry. He was weeks, perhaps days, away from total collapse, from losing everything he had ever worked for. He smiled. He shook hands. He made small talk, all while the ground crumbled beneath his feet. He looked at Serafina, who was talking softly with the elderly wife of a diplomat, her kindness radiating from her like a gentle warmth. He saw her, but he didn't truly see her. He saw her beauty, her grace, but he equated her gentleness with fragility, her artistic nature with a kind of naive weakness. She was a beautiful part of the world he had built, but in his mind, she was fundamentally incapable of understanding the brutal realities of the world that was about to destroy him. The architect of that destruction was in the room, Marcus Thorne. He was not a rival CEO. He was something older, more dangerous, a man who operated in the shadows of the city's financial world, a loan shark with the elegantly tailored suit and polished manners of a king. Thorne's vast, shadowy empire held the debt of dozens of companies, and he had recently acquired the debt that was strangling Ethelred. He had summoned Julian to this very party for a conversation. As Julian approached him, Thorne smiled, a reptilian movement of his thin lips. "A beautiful party, Julian," Thorne said, his voice a low, gravelly purr. "And a beautiful wife. You are a lucky man for now." Later that night, in a private, soundproofed room away from the music and laughter, Thorne laid out the terms of Julian's execution. He detailed with chilling precision every one of Ethelred's financial weaknesses. He explained exactly how he would dismantle the company, piece by piece, leaving Julian with nothing but a mountain of personal debt and a ruined name. The hope that Julian had been clinging to, a desperate, foolish hope, finally died. "What do you want?" Julian asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Your company is worthless to me as it is," Thorne said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "But you have one asset that I find intriguing." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Your wife, the Lady Serafina. She comes from a lineage of impeccable breeding, a true prize. I am an old man, Julian. I find myself in want of a beautiful, cultured companion to adorn my final years." The room went cold. Julian stared at him, his mind unable to process the monstrousness of the proposal. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," Thorne continued, his eyes glittering like chips of ice, "that I am willing to forgive your entire debt I will tear up the notes, give you a fresh line of credit to rebuild. Your company will be saved. In exchange, you will give me her marriage contract. You will annul your union publicly and immediately. She will become my wife." It was not a business proposition. It was an act of profound psychological cruelty. Thorn didn't just want to defeat him. He wanted to own a piece of his soul. He wanted Julian to admit to himself and to the world that his ambition was so absolute, his love so shallow, that he would sell his own wife to protect his legacy. The battle inside Julian's mind was short and brutal. He saw the faces of his hundreds of employees. He saw the Ethel Red logo, the symbol of his life's work. He saw the disappointed face of his father. And then he saw Serafina, a beautiful, fragile thing he could not afford to keep. He made his choice. He returned home in the dead of night, his soul a hollowed-out cavern. He found Serafina asleep in a chair in their library, a book of poetry fallen from her hands. She had been waiting for him. He woke her gently, and the sleepy, loving smile she gave him was a dagger to his heart. He couldn't soften the blow. He couldn't lie. He told her everything, with the cold, detached language of a corporate memo. The debt, the ruin, Thorn's offer, the condition. She stared at him, her smile slowly dissolving into an expression of utter disbelief, then dawning horror. "You're joking," she whispered. "This is a sick, terrible joke." "It's not a joke," he said, avoiding her eyes. He placed the annulment papers on the table between them. He had already signed his name. "It's the only way. The only way," she repeated, her voice rising with an incredulous fury he had never heard from her before. "The only way? You are selling me, Julian? Like a painting, like a piece of stock? Am I just an asset to be traded when your other investments go bad?" The pain in her voice was so raw, so pure, that he almost broke. But he couldn't afford to. He hardened his heart, building a wall of cold pragmatism around it. "You don't understand the real world, Serafina," he said, his voice cruel in its dismissal. "You live in a world of music and art. I live in a world where we do what is necessary to survive. This isn't survival," she said, tears now streaming down her face. "This is damnation." She looked at the papers, at his signature. The man she had loved, the man she had believed in, was a stranger, a moral coward. With a hand that trembled with a rage that eclipsed her pain, she took the pen. She signed her name not with a flourish, but with a hard, angry slash of ink. The deal was done. He had saved his company, and he had just sold the only good thing in his life. If a man trading his wife like property fills you with disgust, comment injustice. Serafina's transition from the wife of Julian to the property of Marcus Thorn was a swift and disorienting fall. Her exile was not to a barren wasteland, but to a gilded cage of unimaginable opulence and menace. Thorn's estate was a fortress on the outskirts of the city, a sprawling compound of dark wood and black marble, surrounded by high walls and silent, watchful guards. Her wedding to him was a cold legal formality, a signing of documents that felt less like a marriage and more like the closing of a hostile takeover. She became the lady of the estate, a new title that felt like a brand on her soul. Thorn, true to his word, treated her like his most prized possession. He draped her in jewels so heavy they felt like chains, and gowns so exquisite they felt like costumes. He paraded her at his dark, smoke-filled gatherings, where powerful, dangerous men with dead eyes would look at her with a mixture of desire and appraisal, knowing exactly how she had been acquired. In the beginning, despair was her only companion. She felt like a ghost haunting the halls of her own life. The gentle artist had been erased, replaced by a beautiful silent ornament. Dante had been indifferent to her mind. Thorn initially seemed to be as well. He wanted her for her beauty, for the symbol of his victory over his young rival. But Thorn was a man who had survived and thrived in the criminal underworld for 50 years. He was a master observer of human nature, a connoisseur of strength and weakness. And unlike Dante, he was not blinded by arrogance. He was curious. The transformation began one evening during a tense dinner with a rival syndicate leader. The man was being belligerent, making veiled threats. Serafina, sitting silently at the end of the long table, noticed something no one else did. The rival's bodyguard, standing behind him, had a nervous tick, his hand repeatedly twitching towards the inside of his jacket. It was a small, almost imperceptible sign of anxiety. After the dinner, Thorne was furious about the disrespect he had been shown. "He thinks I am weak," Thorne growled. "No," Serafina said, her voice quiet but clear. "He is the one who is weak. He is afraid. His man was ready to draw his weapon at the slightest provocation. They came here expecting a war, not a negotiation. They are bluffing." Thorne stopped pacing and stared at her. He had seen the twitching bodyguard too, but he had dismissed it. She had seen it and correctly interpreted its meaning. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw past the beautiful facade and saw a mind that was sharp, observant, and analytical. He had acquired a show pony, only to discover he was in possession of a thoroughbred racehorse. Intrigued, he began to include her, not in the violence, but in the strategy. He started leaving business ledgers open on his desk, asking for her opinion on investment opportunities, on the loyalty of his lieutenants. He was testing her, probing her intellect. Serafina, seeing this as her only possible path to something other than being a decorative object, seized the opportunity with a desperate hunger. She devoured the books in his library, not on art, but on economics, on game theory, on the history of criminal empires. She learned about money laundering, about offshore accounts, about leveraging fear and loyalty. The part of her brain that understood the complex structures of a fugue now applied itself to the complex structures of a criminal enterprise. The gentle musician learned the brutal mathematics of survival. She became his most trusted advisor, his secret weapon. Her quiet, unassuming presence made men underestimate her, and she used that to her advantage, listening, observing, and offering Thorne insights that were as brilliant as they were ruthless. Her final test and ultimate rebirth came 5 years into her exile. Thorne's health, always robust, began to fail rapidly. He knew he was dying. He had no son, no heir he trusted. His lieutenants were wolves, ready to tear his empire apart the moment he was gone. One night he summoned Serafina to his study. "I'm leaving it all to you," he said, his voice weak, but his eyes as sharp as ever. "The businesses, the accounts, the loyalty of my men, if you can hold it." "Why?" she asked, genuinely shocked. "Because," he rasped, a dry, humorless smile on his lips, "you are the only person I have ever met who is as ruthless as I am, but who still has a soul. And because the idea of that pretty boy Julian discovering that the woman he sold is now the queen of the world that terrifies him, it is the only thing that still makes me laugh." When Marcus Thorne died, the underworld held its breath, expecting a bloody power vacuum. Instead, they got Serafina. She met with the rival syndicates, not with threats but with business proposals. She met with Thorne's lieutenants, not demanding loyalty, but offering them a more profitable, more stable future under her leadership. She was not a brute. She was a strategist, and she consolidated her power with a speed and efficiency that left everyone, including herself, stunned. The girl who was sold had become the new mob boss. She was the undisputed queen of the city's shadows. And now, after 5 long years, she was finally ready to schedule a meeting to discuss the outstanding debts of a small electronics company called Ethelred Incorporated. The queen was coming for the pawn who had sacrificed her. For Julian, the 5 years since he sold his wife had been a slow, grinding purgatory. The bailout from Marcus Thorne had saved his company from immediate collapse, but it came at the cost of his autonomy. The fresh line of credit was a gilded leash. Ethelred Inc. became a vassal state to Thorne's shadowy empire, forced into partnerships that benefited Thorne, required to use his suppliers, his logistics. Julian was still the president, his name on the letterhead, but he was a king in name only, constantly aware of the invisible hand that guided his company's fate. The guilt from his betrayal of Serafina had long since been buried under layers of resentment and the daily struggle for corporate survival. He had forced himself not to think of her, to relegate her to a chapter of his life that was closed and sealed. He told himself that he had made the only choice he could, but on long, sleepless nights, her face, a mixture of shock and utter devastation, would sometimes surface in his memory. A ghost he couldn't quite exorcise. The news of Marcus Thorne's death had been a seismic event in the city's underworld, with ripples felt even in the legitimate business community. For Julian, it was a moment of cautious, terrified hope. Was this his chance to finally break free? Or would Thorne's empire simply pass to a new, even more ruthless successor who would finally decide to foreclose on his soul? The summons for a meeting came a month later. The letter was simple, printed on heavy, expensive-looking paper, bearing the sigil of Thorne's organization. It requested his presence at their headquarters, a discreet, unmarked skyscraper downtown, known to insiders as the Citadel, to discuss the restructuring of Ethelred's outstanding financial obligations. Julian prepared for the meeting as if for war. He gathered his financial reports, his projections, his arguments for why Ethelred was on a path to recovery and should be granted more lenient terms. He expected to face a council of Thorne's lieutenants, grizzled, dangerous men who had carved out their own fiefdoms within the organization. He walked into the Citadel, the lobby silent and intimidating, all black marble and brushed steel. He was escorted by two silent, imposing guards to the top floor, to Thorne's private boardroom. The room was vast, with a panoramic window that offered a god's-eye view of the city. A long, polished mahogany table dominated the space, and at the head of the table, in Thorne's high-backed leather chair, sat a woman. Julian's mind took a moment to process the scene. He had been so braced for a confrontation with a group of violent men that the presence of a lone woman was disorienting. She was staring out the window, her back to him. All he could see was a cascade of dark hair and the severe, elegant line of a black power suit. Then she turned. The world stopped. The air in Julian's lungs turned to ice. It was Serafina. But it was a Serafina he had never seen, not even in his nightmares. The gentle, artistic soul he had sold was gone, replaced by a woman who radiated an aura of absolute lethal authority. The softness in her face had been sharpened into a breathtaking, dangerous beauty. Her eyes, once warm and full of a quiet love for him, were now cold, calculating, and utterly unreadable. They held the chilling stillness of a predator that knows it has no equal in the room. This was not the wife he remembered. This was not the victim of his betrayal. This was the heir to Marcus Thorne's throne. "Julian," she said. His name on her lips was not a greeting. It was a judgment. Her voice, once a soft melody, was now a low, controlled alto, each word perfectly enunciated, each syllable carrying the weight of the power she now wielded. "Please, sit. We have much to discuss." He moved woodenly, his body acting on autopilot, while his mind reeled in a state of catastrophic shock. He sank into a chair opposite her, the polished table between them feeling like a chasm. He could feel the eyes of the two guards, standing like statues in the corners of the room, on him. "Serafina, how?" The question was a weak, pathetic whisper. A faint, ironic smile touched her lips. "Marcus was a collector of rare and valuable things," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "He was also a surprisingly effective teacher. He believed in nurturing potential. It seems he saw something in me that you overlooked." The insult was delivered with the precision of a scalpel, leaving a clean, deep wound. She slid a single folder across the table. It was his company's entire debt portfolio, every loan, every obligation he had to Thorne's empire. "As the new head of this organization," she continued, her voice all business, "I am in the process of reviewing all of our assets. And you, Julian, are currently my most underperforming asset." She leaned forward, her eyes locking with his, and he felt a primal fear he hadn't experienced since his first meeting with Thorne. "So, this is what is going to happen. You will continue to run Ethelred, but you will no longer be running it for yourself. You will be running it for me. You will meet whatever profit targets I set. You will implement whatever strategies I dictate. You will, for all intents and purposes, be my employee. Your company is mine, your future is mine, and your life is mine to do with as I please." He stared at her, at the woman he had sold, the woman who now owned him in every way that mattered. The terror he felt was mingled with a horrifying, unwanted spark of something else, an obsessive, all-consuming fascination. The pawn he had sacrificed had returned to the board as a queen, and she had just declared checkmate. The weeks following that first meeting were a masterclass in psychological warfare, orchestrated by Serafina with a chilling precision. She did not dismantle Ethelred Inc. or fire Julian. That would have been too merciful. Instead, she began to tighten her grip, turning his life and his company into a meticulously controlled experiment in humiliation. She implemented a new reporting structure that required him to attend weekly performance reviews at the Citadel. These were not business meetings, they were subjugations. In the same boardroom where she had declared his new reality, she would sit, flanked by her new lieutenants, hard, silent men who had once served Thorn, and force Julian to justify every decision, every expense, every fractional dip in his company's performance. She was a brilliant and exacting master. She had absorbed all of Thorn's cunning, but she wielded it with an artist's touch. She would find the smallest flaw in his projections, the slightest weakness in his strategy, and expose it with a calm, surgical question that would leave him speechless and sweating in his expensive suit. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. Her power was in her quiet, absolute control. She would listen to his lengthy, desperate defenses, and then, with a single dismissive wave of her hand, say, "That is not good enough. Find a better way." She was not just running his company, she was deconstructing him, forcing him to see his own inadequacies through her cold, discerning eyes. Julian, in turn, was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. Every waking moment was consumed by his new reality. He worked with a frantic, desperate energy, not for success, but for survival. He drove his teams to the breaking point, trying to meet the impossible targets Serafina set for him. His life became a blur of sleepless nights and caffeine-fueled days, all leading up to the weekly ritual of his own debasement. And through it all, his obsession with her grew. It was a toxic, cancerous thing, a mixture of fear, hatred, and a terrifying, all-consuming admiration. He began to study her, not just as his new boss, but as a phenomenon. He replayed their meetings in his mind, analyzing her every word, her every gesture. He saw the way she commanded the respect and the fear of the dangerous men who now served her. He saw the brilliant, strategic mind behind her every move. The gentle, naive artist he had sold was a distant memory, a ghost. In her place was this formidable queen, a woman of steel and shadow, and he found himself, to his horror, irresistibly drawn to her. It was not love. It was a moth's fatal attraction to a flame, a primal pull towards the very power that was destroying him. He started to see her everywhere, even when she wasn't there. He would be in a meeting with his own executives and find himself thinking, what would Serafina say about this? How would she dismantle this argument? She had gotten inside his head. The power play extended beyond the boardroom. She began to subtly dismantle his personal life. She bought the building where his favorite, exclusive restaurant was located and terminated their lease. She bought out the small private bank that had handled his family's personal finances for generations and had his accounts transferred. They were small, petty acts of power, designed to remind him that there was no corner of his life that she could not reach, no sanctuary where he was safe from her influence. The tension between them became a palpable, living thing. One night, after a particularly brutal review where she had publicly eviscerated his quarterly growth strategy, he followed her out of the boardroom. "Why are you doing this, Serafina?" he demanded, cornering her in the hallway outside. "This isn't business. This is torture." She turned to him, her expression unreadable in the dim light of the corridor. "You are mistaken," she said, her voice a low purr. "This is business. I am simply maximizing the return on my investment. I invested 5 years of my life in Marcus Thorne's world because of you. I am simply ensuring that my investment pays dividends." He stared at her, at the cold beauty of her face, and he was overwhelmed by a sudden, desperate urge. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the expensive fabric of her suit jacket. "This has to stop," he whispered, his voice raw. She looked down at his hand on her arm, and then back up at his face. She didn't pull away. Instead, a slow, dangerous smile touched her lips. "Does it?" she whispered back. "I'm just getting started." The air between them crackled with a forbidden energy, a volatile mix of his desperation and her power. his hatred and his unwilling desire. He had sold her into the darkness, and now he found himself desperate for a single spark of the fire she had become. Julian's obsession, now fully ignited, began to manifest in dangerous ways. He was no longer just trying to survive her weekly reviews. He was trying to understand her, to get inside the fortress she had built around herself. He started using the resources of his own company, not for business, but for espionage against its new master. He hired a discreet private investigator, a man who specialized in the city's underworld, with a single, desperate mandate: find out everything about Serafina's life. He wanted to know about her 5 years with Marcus Thorne. He wanted to know how she had transformed from a pianist into a crime lord. He wanted to know who her enemies were, what her weaknesses were. He told himself it was for strategic advantage, to find leverage in their power struggle. But it was a lie. He was a man possessed, desperate to understand the woman who was both his tormentor and the object of his fixation. The information that came back was fragmented and chilling. It painted a picture of a woman who had not just survived, but thrived in a world of violence and betrayal. The investigator brought him stories of how she had calmly negotiated peace treaties between warring factions, how she had outmaneuvered seasoned criminals, how she had consolidated Thorne's chaotic empire into a ruthlessly efficient organization. Every story, every piece of evidence of her strength and cunning only served to deepen his obsession. The gentle woman he had known was a ghost. This new Serafina was a myth, a legend in the city's shadows. The secret that would ultimately redefine their conflict was not a hidden document or a forgotten past event. It was the very nature of the empire she now commanded, and a threat that came with it. One of Thorne's oldest and most violent rivals, a man named Victor, had seen Thorne's death and Serafina's ascension as a sign of weakness, an opportunity to seize control. Victor's syndicate began to aggressively move against her interests, starting a bloody turf war in the city's underbelly. Serafina, for all her strategic brilliance, was now facing a kind of threat that Thorne had kept at bay through sheer brutal reputation. She was a queen with a new crown, and the old wolves were circling, testing her strength. Julian learned of this through his investigator, who brought him whispers of ambushes, of loyal men of Serafina's turning up dead, of a war escalating in the shadows, and for the first time, the primary emotion Julian felt was not satisfaction at her vulnerability, but a cold, sickening fear for her. The thought of Victor, a man known for his barbarism, getting his hands on her, was an image that made his blood run cold. He had to warn her. It was an irrational, self-destructive impulse. Warning her would mean admitting he was spying on her, a move that could have fatal consequences. But the alternative, doing nothing, letting her face this danger alone, was unthinkable. He arranged a meeting not at the Citadel, but at a neutral, quiet, high-end art gallery after hours. When she arrived, flanked by her guards, her face was a mask of suspicion. Real could give her a decisive advantage in her war with Victor. But trusting him, the man who was the very architect of her pain, felt like a form of madness. It was a test of her instincts. Could she separate the man he was from the asset he could be? Why? She finally asked, the single word cutting through the tension. Why would you do this? What's in it for you? He looked at her, and in that moment, under the soft gallery lights, surrounded by silent, beautiful art, he finally admitted the truth, if only to himself. His obsession wasn't just about fascination. It was a twisted, broken, all-consuming form of love. He couldn't have her. He couldn't save her from what he had done to her. But he could, perhaps, keep her alive. Because, he said, his voice raw with an emotion he could no longer hide, in a world where you exist, even as my enemy, is infinitely better than a world without you in it. The revelation hung in the air between them. It was not a confession of love, but something far more primal, a declaration of allegiance born from the ashes of his own obsession. He was choosing a side, and his side was hers. Serafina did not accept Julian's offer immediately. To do so would have been a sign of weakness. Instead, she left the gallery, leaving him in a state of agonizing uncertainty. But his words, and the raw, desperate sincerity with which he had spoken them, had planted a seed of doubt in her hardened heart. She had spent 5 years viewing him as a one-dimensional villain, the weak, ambitious man who had sold her. But his confession revealed a man of terrifying complexity, a man whose motivations had twisted from betrayal to a dangerous, protective obsession. She put his information to the test. She sent her own people to discreetly verify the details he had given her about Victor's shipping operations. The information was flawless. It was the kind of deep insider knowledge that could only come from years of forced, unwilling partnership. He had handed her a loaded gun. This action on his part forced Serafina to confront the nature of her own quest. Her return had been fueled by a righteous, cold fury. She wanted revenge. She wanted to see him broken, to make him feel a fraction of the powerlessness she had felt. But now, as she held the key to her enemy's destruction, she found that the man she was targeting was actively trying to save her from a different, more immediate enemy. The clean lines of her revenge had become messy, complicated. Julian, meanwhile, existed in a self-imposed purgatory. He had laid his cards on the table and now lived in constant, low-grade fear. He knew that as a threat, a sign that he knew too much and have him eliminated without a second thought. But his fear for his own life was secondary to his fear for hers. His regret was no longer a passive internal state. It had become an active, driving force. He began to systematically dismantle his old life, a quiet, methodical quest for a forgiveness he knew he would never receive. His quest began with Ethelred Inc. He called an emergency meeting with his board of directors and did the unthinkable. He confessed everything. He told them about the true nature of his company's relationship with Marcus Thorne's empire, about the forced partnerships, the compromised ethics. He then presented a radical plan, a strategic downsizing and restructuring, cutting off all ties to any entity even remotely connected to the criminal underworld, even if it meant a massive drop in profits. He was choosing to amputate the diseased parts of his company to save its soul, the very opposite of the choice he had made 5 years earlier. "We will be a smaller company," he told the shocked board, "but we will be an honest one, and we will be our own." His next act was for Serafina, though she did not know it. He used his personal fortune to quietly buy back the few remaining assets of her family's old estate, the ones that had been sold off after their financial decline. It was a small portfolio of art and a countryside home. He placed the deeds in a blind trust, with instructions for them to be transferred to her anonymously on the 5-year anniversary of her marriage to Thorne. It was not an attempt to buy her forgiveness. It was a quiet act of to give back a piece of the world she had lost. But his most significant act of contrition was a personal one. He sought out her parents. They were living in quiet retirement, their lives forever scarred by the shame and fear his actions had caused. He went to their home, not as the powerful CEO, but as a penitent. He did not make excuses. He did not try to explain. He simply stood before them and said, "I am responsible for the pain your daughter has endured. There are no words to express my sorrow. I am here today not to ask for your forgiveness, which I do not deserve, but to make you a promise. I'm trying to keep her safe." The father, a man of quiet dignity, simply looked at him. "The girl we raised," he said, his voice heavy, "died the day you sold her. The woman who returned, she does not need your protection. She needs your honesty." The words were a quiet condemnation, but also a sliver of guidance. His quest for forgiveness could not be about grand gestures or secret acts of charity. It had to be about one thing, the truth. And the truth was that he was bound to Serafina by a shared history of pain and a new terrifying reality where their survival might just depend on each other. If you believe his attempts at redemption are genuine, comment regret. Serafina, armed with the intel from Julian, orchestrated a masterful counterattack against Victor. It was not a bloody street war, but a series of precise, devastating financial strikes. Using the weaknesses Julian had exposed, she crippled Victor's shipping routes, intercepted his illicit cash flows, and sowed dissent among his key lieutenants by exposing his vulnerabilities. Within a month, Victor's organization was in chaos, his power shattered from within. She had won, and she had done it using Thorne's ruthless strategies and Julian's insider knowledge. She had, in a strange and twisted way, become a synthesis of the two men who had defined her life. With the external threat neutralized, a new, unnerving quiet settled between her and Julian. He had proven his loyalty in the most dramatic way possible, and she had, by using his information, implicitly accepted his allegiance. The weekly performance reviews at the Citadel stopped. The dynamic of master and servant, of creditor and debtor, had become obsolete. They were now something else, something undefined and far more dangerous: allies. The healing of their fractured relationship began not with words of forgiveness, but with a shared purpose. Julian's restructuring of Ethelred Inc. was a monumental task. He was excising years of corrupt partnerships and shady deals, a process that left the company smaller, weaker but clean. Serafina, who could have easily watched him struggle and fail, began to act. She did not offer a bailout. Instead, she began to send legitimate, clean business his way. She used her vast network to connect him with new suppliers, new markets, all of them above board. She would call him, her voice all business, and say, "There is an opportunity in the renewable energy sector. A company in Germany is looking for a new tech partner. Your new battery prototype would be a perfect fit. I have arranged a meeting for you." She was, in essence, rebuilding his company with him. It was a strange, unspoken partnership. They would spend hours on the phone, not as ex-spouses, but as two CEOs collaborating on strategy. They would debate market trends, analyze competitors, and find a surprising, exhilarating synergy in their shared intellect. In these conversations, the walls between them began to crumble. She saw the brilliant, passionate innovator he had been before Thorn, and his own ambition had corrupted him. He, in turn, saw the woman behind the fearsome queen of the underworld, a woman with a sharp, insightful mind and a dry, unexpected wit. The true healing, however, happened away from the world of business. Julian, as part of his penance, had started volunteering at a community center in one of the city's poorer districts, a place that provided after-school programs for underprivileged kids. He never told Serafina about it, but one day she was there. She was the anonymous benefactor who had been funding the center for years, a secret she had kept even from Thorn. They found each other in the art room, surrounded by the chaotic, joyful energy of children painting. He was awkwardly trying to help a little boy mix colors. She was watching, a small, genuine smile on her face. "You're a long way from the Citadel," she said, her voice soft. "So are you," he replied, a smear of blue paint on his cheek. In that moment, stripped of their titles and their power, they were just two people, witnessing a simple, uncorrupted form of creation. "This is what matters, isn't it?" he said, more to himself than to her. "Building something that actually makes a difference." "It is," she agreed. "It's the only thing that lasts." From that day on, the community center became their neutral ground, their sanctuary. They would meet there once a week, not to talk business, but to work. He would help the kids with their homework. She would lead the art classes. They watched each other in these new roles. He saw her patience, her gentle encouragement, the way her whole face lit up when a child created something they were proud of. He saw the soul of the artist he had once known, not broken, but transformed and deepened by her trials. She, in turn, saw a man genuinely trying to atone. She saw his awkward kindness with the children, the way he listened to their stories with a focus he once reserved for stock reports. She saw him slowly, painstakingly, rebuilding his own moral compass. The pain of his betrayal had not disappeared, but it was being overlaid with new memories, new evidence of the man he was becoming. The scar was still there, but the wound was finally starting to close. They were not falling in love in the traditional sense. They were two survivors of a shipwreck, stranded on a deserted island, who, after years of blaming each other, were finally learning to work together to build a raft. The fragile peace they had built was an anomaly in the world they inhabited, and the world does not suffer anomalies for long. The remnants of Victor's shattered syndicate, leaderless and hungry, did not simply disappear. A new, younger, and far more reckless leader, a man named Dmitri, rose from the ashes. Dmitri did not possess Victor's strategic patience. He was a creature of pure, violent ambition, and he saw Serafina not just as a rival, but as an illegitimate ruler, a woman who had no right to Thorne's throne. He decided to make a play for the entire empire, and he knew that the key to it all was the perceived weakness in Serafina's armor: Julian. Dimitri's plan was not to start a street war with Serafina, which he knew he would lose. His plan was to use Julian to destroy her from within. He began by targeting Ethelred Inc. A series of accidents began to plague Julian's newly cleaned operations. A critical shipment from a new supplier would be mysteriously lost at the docks. A key piece of machinery in his factory would malfunction, causing weeks of delays. A fire, ruled as accidental by a bribed inspector, destroyed one of his warehouses. They were acts of corporate sabotage designed to look like bad luck, but Julian and Serafina knew better. It was a message from Dimitri: "I can touch you whenever I want." The attacks put immense pressure on Ethelred, threatening to undo all the progress Julian had made. He found himself in a familiar position, his company once again on the brink. But this time, his first instinct was not to sacrifice, but to protect. His primary concern was not for his company, but for Serafina. He knew that this was not about him. It was about her. He was the bait in a trap designed to lure her out. He went to her, not as a subordinate, but as a partner in a crisis. "He's trying to draw you into a war," Julian said, laying out the evidence of the sabotage in her office at the Citadel. "He wants you to retaliate, to get your hands dirty, to create chaos that he can exploit. He thinks you'll overreact to protect your investment in me." "You are not an investment, Julian," she said, her voice a low, dangerous calm. "You are an ally, and no one touches my allies." In that moment, they became a unified command. The threat designed to separate them instead fused them together. They moved their base of operations to a secure location, a high-tech bunker beneath the Citadel, and began to fight back. It was a battle of wits, a war fought in the shadows. He, with his intimate knowledge of the corporate world, began to trace Dimitri's legitimate business fronts, the clean companies he used to launder his money and project an image of legitimacy. He became her white-collar general. She, in turn, used her underworld network to gather intelligence, to track Dimitri's movements, to understand his psychology. She became his spy master. They worked side by side, day and night, fueled by coffee and a shared, electrifying purpose. The last vestiges of their old identities, the betrayer and the betrayed, were burned away in the crucible of this new crisis. They saw each other only as their most essential selves, a brilliant strategist and a ruthless tactician. The final confrontation was a trap of their own design. Using Julian's research, they identified Dimitri's proudest legitimate acquisition, a high-end exclusive hotel. It was his crown jewel, his symbol of his arrival in the legitimate world. They knew he would do anything to protect it. Serafina, using her underworld contacts, arranged for a rumor to be spread, that a high-stakes meeting of all the other rival syndicate leaders was to take place at that very hotel, a meeting to carve up Dimitri's territory. It was a bluff, but a perfect one. Dimitri, paranoid and arrogant, could not risk ignoring it. He flooded the hotel with his own men, leaving his other operations vulnerable. It was the opening they needed. While Dimitri's forces were concentrated on the phantom meeting, Serafina's people, guided by Julian's logistical plans, executed a series of lightning-fast, bloodless raids on Dimitri's core operations, seizing his assets, confiscating his data, and arresting his key people with the help of a discreetly tipped-off police task force. By the time Dimitri realized he had been played, it was too late. His organization was decapitated, his power evaporated overnight. The final threat had been eliminated. In the aftermath, in the quiet of their command center in the early hours of the morning, Julian and Serafina stood before a large screen displaying the success of their operation. They had won, not as individuals, but as a single, perfectly synchronized unit. He had returned from his exile, not just to atone, but to become her shield. And she had allowed him back in, not just for forgiveness, but because she had realized he made her stronger. They had faced the final threat, and in doing so had forged a bond that was more powerful than any business empire or criminal syndicate. The defeat of Dmitri was a definitive, resounding victory that solidified Serafina's reign as the undisputed queen of the city's underworld. But for both her and Julian, the victory felt different from any they had experienced before. It was not a solitary triumph, but a shared one. In the quiet aftermath of their war, a new unspoken reality settled between them. The lines that had once defined them, betrayer and betrayed, master and servant, allies of convenience, had all been erased. What remained was something raw, powerful, and deeply intimate. They were partners in every sense of the word. The love that Julian had confessed in the art gallery, a desperate, obsessive thing, had been tempered in the fire of their shared battle, emerging as something more solid, more real, and the respect that Serafina felt for him had blossomed into a profound, undeniable affection. The criminal empire she commanded, once a symbol of her painful transformation, now felt like a gilded cage of a different kind. It was a world of darkness and violence, a world she had mastered out of necessity, but it was not a world where a future with the man he had become could truly flourish. She began to do something that even Marcus Thorne would have thought impossible. She began to legitimize her empire. With Julian now acting as her most trusted advisor, she started a slow, meticulous process of selling off the illicit parts of her organization and reinvesting the vast profits into legitimate high-growth sectors: technology, renewable energy, real estate. She was using the tools of the underworld to build a new, clean foundation. She was, in essence, laundering not just her money, but her entire life. Julian, watching her, was filled with a sense of awe. He was witnessing her final greatest transformation, from a victim to a queen to a true visionary. He was no longer trying to atone for his past. He was actively helping her build their future. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he could not imagine that future without her as his wife, not by a contract or a deal, but by a choice, freely made. But how to ask? A traditional proposal, with a diamond ring and a bended knee, felt laughably inadequate to capture the sheer scale and strangeness of their story. He found his answer in the place where their journey had begun, the grand ballroom of the hotel where he had first seen her after her return, the site of the charity gala. He rented the entire ballroom for one night. When Serafina arrived, confused by the cryptic invitation, she found the vast space empty except for him. He was standing in the center of the room, not in a tuxedo, but in a simple, well-cut suit. The room was not decorated with flowers or candles. Instead, scattered around the ballroom on easels, were large, framed photographs. "What is this, Julian?" she asked, her voice soft. "This," he said, "is our story." He took her hand and led her on a tour of the makeshift gallery. The first photo was of her, a candid shot from years ago, playing the piano, a look of pure, unburdened joy on her face. "This was the woman I was too blind to see," he said. The next photo was of him, taken from a business magazine, looking arrogant and powerful. This was the fool who threw her away. He led her to the next photo, a dark, grainy security still of the two of them in the boardroom at the Citadel, the tension between them a visible force. This was the beginning of our war. The next was a photo he had secretly taken on his phone of her in the community center, laughing with a child. This was when I started to see the Queen. The final photo was a still from the security feed of their command center during the fight against Dmitri, the two of them standing side by side, looking at the screen, a team. "We have had more endings and beginnings than most people have in 10 lifetimes, he said, turning to face her. "We have been husband and wife, enemies, master and servant, allies. I have sold you, and I have fought for you. You have hated me, and you have saved me." He reached into his pocket, but what he pulled out was not a ring box. It was a simple blank contract elegantly printed on heavy paper. "I am not asking you to forget our past, Serafina. I am asking you to build a new future with me, one that honors all of it. This is a new contract," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It has only one clause, that we face everything from this day forward together, as partners, as equals, as whatever we choose to be." He then did get down on one knee. and this time he opened a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, but it was not a diamond. It was a stunning dark sapphire, the color of a twilight sky, the same color as the dress she had worn on the night he betrayed her. "I want to replace the worst memory of my life with the best one," he whispered. "Serafina, the woman who rose from the ashes and taught me the meaning of strength, of honor, and of love. Will you be my wife for real this time?" Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of a profound, cleansing joy. He was not asking her to forget her journey. He was celebrating it. He was honoring the queen she had become. In the center of the grand ballroom, surrounded by the ghosts of their past, she gave him her answer. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, Julian. On one condition." "Anything," he breathed. "That from now on," she said, a brilliant, true smile finally reaching her eyes. "We are always on the same side." 3 years later, the sun sets over a calm blue sea, its golden light glinting off the clean, modern lines of a stunning cliffside villa. This is not a fortress or a corporate monument. It is a home. Inside, the sound of a child's laughter mixes with the soft notes of a cello. Serafina is playing, not with the melancholic longing of her past, but with a deep, peaceful joy. Julian is on the floor, building an elaborate tower of blocks with their 2-year-old son, a boy with his father's determined eyes and his mother's gentle smile, named Marcus, in a final, ironic act of turning a name associated with pain into one of hope. Their life is one that none could have predicted. Having successfully transitioned her entire empire into a legitimate global investment firm, Serafina is now one of the most respected and feared businesswomen in the world. But her ruthlessness in the boardroom is matched only by her generosity and philanthropy. Julian, having found his true calling, acts as the managing director of their charitable foundation, a role he performs with a quiet passion and humility that continues to astound those who knew him in his former life. They are, by all accounts, the ultimate power couple, but their power is now used to build, not to destroy. Ethelred Inc., the other company for which he sacrificed everything, is now a thriving, independent subsidiary of their new joint enterprise, a testament to the fact that they did not erase their past, but integrated it into their present. On a wall in their home, there is a single strange piece of art. It is the original nullified marriage contract, the one he sold, now framed between 2 pieces of glass. On the back, in Serafina's elegant script, is written a single quote from an old philosopher. "The world breaks everyone, and afterward, many are strong at the broken places." As the last note of the cello fades, Julian looks up at his wife. She smiles at him, a real unguarded smile, the kind he once thought he had lost forever. Their son toddles over to her, and she lifts him into her lap. Julian joins them, wrapping his arms around his family. They are not a fairy tale. They are survivors. Their love story was not written in the stars, but forged in the darkest corners of the human heart. It is a testament to the idea that even after the most profound betrayals, a new, stronger foundation can be built. The narrator closes with a calm, wise voice. "They say that revenge is a dish best served cold, but the story of Julian and Serafina teaches us that redemption is a feast best shared. They were a king who sold his queen, and a queen who returned to conquer a kingdom. But in the ruins of their war, they discovered a truth more powerful than any empire. That true strength isn't about how much you can take from the world, but about how much you are willing to give back. And that the greatest love stories are not about finding the perfect person, but about 2 broken people who together find a way to become whole." The final shot is of the 3 of them, silhouetted against the setting sun, a small, unbreakable kingdom of their own making. If this story moved you, share it now and type "shared" in the comments below. End.